All right, everyone, welcome. Let's get started with the webinar. So thanks for your time today. I'll be taking you through the data interoperability framework that is currently out for public consultation through the Department of Ag website. And so this piece of work is being funded through the DAF Traceability program and is, as I said, currently out for consultation. It's a draft, and then we're looking to get feedback from industry and then update this paper back and provide it back to DAF. So it's very important that we get everyone's feedback, and the reason we're doing today's session is so that I can give you a brief presentation about the content of the paper and also give you an opportunity to ask questions, because what we've been finding is that there have been some questions. It is a little bit of a complex topic, and it also affects lots of different industry and supply chain partners in different ways. So today's session is going to be a very short presentation, maybe about 10 minutes from me, and then it's open time for you to ask me any questions to help you provide that feedback. So let's get started with, I've got a couple of slides to show you. And oh, sorry, just a little bit of housekeeping. You can pop your questions into the Q&A box. You'll see that in the Zoom control bar, and then I'll get to them all after I've taken you through these few slides. All right, perfect. So as I mentioned, this consultation paper that's out at the moment is specifically addressing data interoperability and specifically for agricultural traceability data and also product data. And I'll get into that a little bit in a second. So why these two types of data, first of all? So traceability data is critical for ensuring that we can track products through the supply chain. And the reasons for that, of course, are things like food safety and biosecurity. And now there are even more requirements coming through from our international trading partners for not just traceability data, but also product data that satisfies consumer and regulatory requirements. And some of that data that we're starting to see come through is things like emissions and deforestation status, and soon there'll be even more, such as biodiversity and modern slavery requirements that will be coming through as well. So we're only just starting to see some of those product data requirements coming in, even though for traceability, there have been requirements for a long time. But even those have started to step up. So with the US bringing in their Food Safety Modernization Act, that's going to be starting from January 2026, they will be requiring more traceability data to be provided with particular products being imported. So the whole point of us being able to attach all this data to the products that we are selling domestically and internationally is to prove that we have high quality and also then sustainable and safe products. And so the role of data interoperability in that is that as this demand for data is increasing and is only going to increase, we need to be able to provide that data in consistent ways and also make it easy for it to be provided. So at the moment, we have a lot of diversity and fragmentation in the data, which means there's a lot of different data sets. They don't have things named or labeled inside of them exactly the same ways. And so when it's time to combine them or analyze them together, it just takes so much more effort. It's not very efficient. And it also means that we're often reporting the same data into multiple systems under different labels. And so the goal and the role of data interoperability here is for us to start to be able to identify which data is actually being requested in many places, and is it being called different things, and how do we make that more efficient, and also make sure that that process is scalable as more and more data is being requested. And so the data interoperability framework really provides this skeleton for being able to do that. It's made up of 3 components. So principles, which I'll talk about in a second, then recommended artifacts, and these can be really varied, and I'll talk about that in a second as well. But at a high level, it could be things like data standards, guidelines, vocabularies, even data models. And then a governance structure that actually underpins the management of all these things. So it's really quite a generic container that we need to then populate with a whole lot of different helpful artifacts, guides, and components that will help everyone become more interoperable. I think it's important also to say is that we're not recommending particular architectures here. What we really want to do is see what standards exist or need to be developed that will enable interoperability. So thinking about that first part of the framework, which is the principles, we've got the inclusivity, so making sure that we are, it's the standards and the artifacts that we are recommending will apply to, cross-commodity at a national level, to anything that needs to be traced or anything that needs to provide product data with it. That there's data rights and privacy as a key principle, which means that there will be some standards and frameworks that will be recommended under this this framework here that will address those things, because we want to make sure that any data that is being shared down the supply chain is kept as private as the sender would like it to be. Adoption, so making sure that we are considering what standards already exist out there and are adopted. And also we are thinking about how the framework itself can be adopted. Flexibility, which is about making sure that we accommodate for differences across commodities and subdomains in Australian agriculture. That there's integrity, so that the standards that we put out are sound, and consistency with international standards and requirements, because we don't want to be creating or developing things that are fit for Australia but then don't really work across borders. The types of artifacts that we're then talking about including in the framework, and there are things like data standards, and these could vary at different levels. So already in the initial list of recommended standards that you'll find in the data standards paper that's out for consultation are things like everything from a date and time format that we're proposing should be used by all systems, to very specific things like barcode standards and traceability data collection standards, and even verifiable credentials, emerging standards that are starting to be used around the world. So there's quite a range of standards that will be included in the recommended standards list. So that index is one of the artifacts that's being proposed under this framework. Another type of artifact will be a vocabulary. And there are some questions in the paper which we would love your feedback on, around whether that vocabulary needs to be extended to be, taxonomy or an ontology. And that vocabulary is, in the first instance, a list of terms of data elements, which is how we talk about the data, how we describe it, and how we label it. So, for example, if we have something called emissions, then is there a particular formula, and is there a particular format for that piece of data that should be consistent across Australia or across a commodity, or kind of what do we need to make sure that it's interoperable? So that vocabulary is the place to house different data elements and make sure then everyone can use that as a dictionary to use them consistently. And then a canonical data model is the other major artifact that's being proposed, which is a reference data model, where those data elements that are defined in the vocabulary are then presented in a technical way that software developers can pick up and use. So we want to actually go right down to a technical level, not just stay at a definition or vocabulary level, because we want that system interoperability and making sure that if I pick up a data element called emissions, and so does another system provider, that we actually implement it in the same way in a database. So when that data is then sent between databases, it can easily be compared. And so we talk about in the paper these two levels of semantic and syntactic interoperability. Semantics being that vocabulary, and then also the syntax of the messages that are sent around. And then the third part of the framework is the governance and adoption, which is required to make sure that there's a process that runs for updating and maintaining that list of artifacts, and bringing new ones into the list. So, for example, if there are new and emerging standards out there, that we have those vetted and assessed before we add them to the list, and also coordinate with other standards industry bodies to make sure that we've got the right things on the artifacts list. The governance and adoption section in the paper also addresses some of the barriers to adoption, and that could range from, cost prohibitions, like, if software providers are now would be using something like a canonical data model, then what is the cost for them to adopt that? So that there could also be technical challenges on, of how far and wide that's adopted, and even commercial hesitations to where there are already proprietary data models that software providers, for example, have, for them to either share the knowledge that they have created, or even adopt something else in its stead, is a barrier. So we're proposing voluntary adoption of the framework in the first place, rather than making anything mandatory. And then there's a proposal in the paper around how we could stage what is then made mandatory over time. And I think the key point also is that industry would be a key player in prioritizing what needs to be standardized, and that will be consulted in the way that the vocabulary, the data models, and all the other artifacts are created. So in the paper, you'll see there's a diagram and a proposed governance structure that we would like to get feedback on. As I mentioned, the future direction and emerging trends and standards in technology and in agriculture are very important. And so that's the other reason that we need that governance framework, is to scan the landscape and see what is emerging. And for example, some of these verifiable credential standards, which are having now adopted into product traceability and providing sustainability data in Europe. There's quite a few different use cases for that, and a lot of exercises going on to test those out, and something that Australia is also considering. But there will be more and other new types of standards that will always be coming out and being published. So the forum and the governance framework will need to accommodate for new things coming out, and make sure that what we're recommending in terms of artifacts is always kept up to date and fresh. And so the Have Your Say process, which is the Department of Agriculture's public consultation process, is where you'll find this paper. So that will be shared with you that's been shared with you in the invite for this webinar. If you can't find it, you can get in touch with me. I'll let my email be available to all the attendees at the end of this session. And what we're really asking for is all sorts of different industry players to provide feedback, because there is something in there for everyone. We're talking, this paper addresses issues that regulators are experiencing with having data being reported to them in lots of different ways. There's some interoperability issues there. This paper also talks to those who are designing and procuring technology systems and software. to see if those can actually use the framework and the standards that we are proposing here. And even primary producers and other supply chain partners like processors, exporters, importers, we would actually need their expertise to create and review the vocabularies. So even though they might not be using the technical standards that are being proposed in the framework, we actually will be looking to get that expertise to define some of the words, the data elements that need to be passed around industry. So encouraging all of you to provide feedback through the DAF's website. And now I'm going to go to questions. So I might just stop sharing there. I've got a couple. First one is, how do we balance the need for interoperability without sacrificing innovation and flexibility? Well, that's actually an interesting question, because I think it might imply that there's a trade-off between interoperability and innovation and flexibility, which my personal opinion is that there isn't. It is possible to be interoperable and innovative and flexible, even if you have to use some standards. Now, I'll give an example. So if you're already designing software or a database, or even if you already have an existing one, it's not that you need to relabel everything in your database. It's only when you are sharing data that you need to then think about that translation. And we already have to do that when we, for example, create APIs or application programming interfaces. We still have to send that data somehow, and someone is receiving it and has to interpret it. And often we have to then create documentation that goes with that data transfer to say, when I'm sending you a 2-digit number called emissions, what that means, it's, tons of emissions per, I don't know, cubic meter or something like that, whatever the calculation is. Otherwise, you're just receiving a 2-digit number called emissions. You're not really sure what the units are associated with it or what it means. So we still have to have that conversation. At the moment, what having a reference or a canonical data model and a vocabulary will do is just make that process quicker, because we're all looking at the same dictionary or list of data elements. And so when we're seeing their data, we don't have to negotiate one-to-one if we're all aligning to one central vocabulary. So I don't think being interoperable prohibits anyone designing their databases or their software in any particular way. It's just when they go to share that data that all of these standards would be applicable. What's the next one? Next one we've got, and I'm just trying to figure out how to. Yep. Okay. Next one I've got is, could you please comment on why traceability data and product data are defined as separate terms? I would have thought that traceability systems will be reporting on product data. Thank you. Yes, so the reason we have made the distinction there was because traceability is the topic of concern for the program of work that this is falling under for the Department of Ag. And product data are these new requirements that are coming in. They don't always go together. So for example, with traceability, you can be tracing things such as the date you sent a batch or a lot, and then who sent it and where they sent it to, and then who received it. So that kind of in a very simplistic way that would be enough for traceability. Product data would then be to attach what the emissions on that farm, for example, were, or the emissions of that processor were as well. And the other reason we want to just make that distinction is because often they are handled in different ways and have different standards associated with them. Plus, we also wanted to be specific here that we're not trying to define all the data and all of agriculture and aquaculture and fisheries, forestry, fiber. So we do want to be a bit more specific, that it's not, it's not defining, how many animals do you have in your paddock or anything like that. It's only the data that needs to be provided for traceability and for the regulatory and the consumer requirements around and really around sustainability and quality. Hope that explained. What's the next one? Probably, so the next question is, probably one of the biggest challenges that is determining the benefit for technology companies to provide data into the framework. These are the ones that hold the most farm level data. It isn't cheap to build integrations. Interested to hear your thoughts. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to try clicking this button and see if that means you can all see it. No, maybe not. So the benefits for technology companies, I think I'll draw a parallel here with health. So in health, they have had vocabularies and reference data models for quite a while. I used to work in digital health, actually, for a software provider. And often when we were sending data to the big hospital systems, they would require that we use particular international standards and these internationally accepted data models to make it easier to integrate, because they were already using them. Could we also use them? And so it was just easier, again, like I explained before, that you don't have to then recommunicate, retranslate everything. You're already both using the same dictionary, to put it that way. So it's true that it isn't cheap to build integrations. And we're not saying everyone needs to start integrating with everyone. What we're saying is where you do integrate already, let's get some consistency in that so that it makes it easier down the track for when you need to build more integrations. Just saves that doing that point-to-point translation every time. Hope that was helpful. Next question. We've got, there may be a trade-off in adopting interoperable standards with a desire to build proprietary walled gardens for perceiving commercial gain. Whether the latter is actually serving national interest in the bigger picture may be a different question. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Yeah, it's interesting because it is easier to build something for yourself and define it for your own purpose. And that is definitely not in the national interest, because you're doing it probably for a commercial reason, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's really when we're starting to share data at a national scale, or even an industry, or even a commodity scale, and everyone has a slightly different data model, though all those translations are just really painful to do and take a lot of time. And so, yeah, the bigger picture is definitely making it easier for everyone, but it's not trying to get everyone to start integrating with everyone else. It's just to say, when you are doing it, especially for some of the national level data that needs to be shared, like, for example, back to government, to get some consistency on that. Next question. Do you see a role for blockchain technology in this space? Do you think it's realistic? We've been trying to stay away from particular technologies, and really sticking to having like focusing on the vocabularies and the standards more around like date and time, and something that can be standards that can be used by any technology. So I guess even if you're developing a blockchain technology, you still need to define your data elements. Yeah, so there should be no real reason why something like blockchain can still be used for traceability. What we want to make sure is that when that solution is being developed, that the data elements are being called consistent things. So when it is time of that data is to be extracted out of that solution, it can be, again, easily shared without having to do a whole lot of translation. Next question we've got. There seem to be multiple projects looking at interoperability in agriculture. Are we confident that there is either not duplication, or we will end up with a fragmented outcome due to lack of visibility and engagement? Who is coordinating what is being worked on to share the best outcomes? So from the point of view of the data standards working group that's created this paper, we've got about 15 members from across industry there. In terms of multiple projects looking at interoperability, the ones that we know of under the DEF umbrella, we've definitely been speaking to. There's some other ones that are quite big programs, such as the Australian Agri-Food Data Exchange, which we are also in contact with, and the RDCs, or we're also in contact with. So, kind of creating infrastructure at the moment. And we've been trying to engage as many people as we can through this public consultation. But if there are any that that you know of, we'd love to hear about them. And even if we already know about them, that's great. And if it's something new that we haven't been able to discover, because as you say, there's a lot going on in the space, please provide that back in your feedback, because that's really important information. Great. What have we got? Next one. How do you see this working internationally? Excellent question. So it's not just an Australian problem. It is an international problem. And as I said, there's quite a lot of regulation already coming through the Food Modernization Act from the US. Canada's got a similar thing, which is requiring a minimum number of data elements to be provided with products. And there's more regulation coming out of Europe. There isn't a global vocabulary or data model, which is interesting. But there is an ISO, which is the International Standards Organization committee that Australia is representing through Standards Australia. And that committee has been tasked with creating agricultural vocabulary, and then perhaps a reference data model as well. But they're really focusing on agricultural data, so not specifically on traceability or those other sustainability product attributes that we're talking about here. So there's a lot of different pockets of work happening. I think that it's going to take time for it to come together. The ideal would be that something like, and again, I use health as an example, in the health industry, there is an internationally recognized data model that a lot of software companies do use. And again, it's not mandatory to use, it's just something that makes everyone's life easier, that they can refer to, as well as, medicine's got a lot of really well-established vocabularies that have been, that are well adopted out there. So ideally, there could be some kind of global agricultural data model that could be used as a reference, but that doesn't mean that Australia even wouldn't have its own, particular synonyms for some of the data elements, or its own particular customizations for the industries that we have, and also the traceability part. Not sure how that is all going to be worked in together, but yeah, as I mentioned, Standards Australia is representing, is an observer at the moment on that international ISO committee, and also we might have a chance to actually participate more actively in the near future. All right, excellent. That's all the questions. I'm happy to just hang around kind of to the end if people have more questions. But if not, then thank you very much for attending, and really hope to see your feedback coming through this week on the paper.